So before we go live, do you want to do some introductions? That's true. That's true. All right, let's do it. So tell us when we're ready, when you're on, okay? We're ready.
All right, so Mayor, thanks for coming in, we do appreciate it. And we're streaming this live, so we also want to thank you, the people who are tuning in today to hear this conversation. It's actually fits really well with your effort to try to make this much more of a citywide conversation. That's great. We thought before we do anything else, we should all introduce each other, ourselves, because first time around, maybe in another year, we'll all know each other better. So why don't we just start from the right here?
Marilyn Garcia, columnist, editorial board.
Mary Mitchell.
Thomas Frisbee, editorial writer.
Tom McNamee, editorial page editor.
I'm Chris Fusco, editor-in-chief.
Lorraine Forte, I'm editorial writer.
Tina Spondelis, political reporter.
Rachel Hinton, general assignment. Tamika Puckett, chief risk officer.
Susie Park, budget director.
Mayor Lightfoot.
Johnny Bennett, CFO.
Okay, so thanks for coming in. We have a lot of questions, but is there anything you want to start with?
Well, I think the important thing is, and we can talk about obviously a range of issues, but with respect to last night, our desire was to not lay out a budget speech, because that will come in October, but to really start early in the process to let people know where we've come from in these last 100 days, what the size of the deficit is for next year, but also to explain to the average person, which is why we did the budget address at night, what we're looking at as a city financially in the out years as well. We put out a budget forecast every year, but it's a dense, complicated document that a lot of people didn't even know existed, and if they know it existed, it was difficult for them to kind of get their arms around. So one of the other things that we did is to try to make that document much more digestible to the average person. But really, I think, and I hope last night was a call to arms for people not only here in Chicago, but across the state. As you know, Chicago's not the only city in the state of Illinois that's suffering under unfunded pensions. This is an issue for cities and towns across our state. There's been an ongoing conversation about what can be done with police and fire pensions, for example, downstate that are on the cusp of insolvency. So this is really, I think, an issue that has to be a statewide conversation, and I am interested in trying to build the chorus for that, but also willing to lead, because now is the time, I think, for us to really wrestle with this problem that I think has vexed us for way too long. You know, as this expression goes, kicking the can down the road. We're at the end of the road, and there's no more can. So we need to get this done now.
So really that speech yesterday, because a lot of us came out of it and we thought to ourselves, well, I didn't learn anything new, but.
No, I think a lot of people
It
did.
sounds like you weren't speaking to us, you were speaking to people perhaps who are a little less watching this day to day.
Yeah, I'm talking to taxpayers who feel like city government operates completely behind the curtain, and that they really don't understand how it is that the city is utilizing its tax dollars. So it's really that audience that we were speaking to primarily, but not, as I said before, not just here in Chicago, but across the state. This is an issue that really unites a lot of us in cities and towns all over northern Illinois, but also south of I-80.
And WGN, you're all over the place, seriously.
Yes.
It's an audience very broad. So I'll ask my first question, which is, can you tell us, you talked a lot about Springfield, the need to work with the folks in Springfield. What exactly do you want to get out of Springfield?
Well, I think we want things in the short term, but also in the longer term. In the short term, one of the most important things that we need to do is fix the tax structure for casinos. If you look at the legislation that was passed, about 73% of every dollar before the operator actually gets up and running are out the door in taxes. A portion to the city, a portion to the state. And then on top of that, there's the kind of upfront costs that the state is expecting a casino operator to pay, which, by the way, has never been a requirement for any other casino that's been up and running here in the state. Our taxes are about 22 times the taxes that other states and municipalities charge their casino operators outside of Illinois. So we've got a truck structure that just doesn't work, and I think the independent feasibility study made that clear. So one of our primary hopes is that we can work together with the governor and his team, the legislative leaders, and really members across the aisle to get a tax structure that sees us standing up a Chicago casino, which inures not only just to the benefit of the city, but the state. Part of the state's capital plan is focused on revenue coming in from casinos, and also repatriates about $260 million every year that's going over the border to Indiana.
Right, and that's number one in Springfield? What else? Do you
Well,
get?
as you know, there's a limit to what a mayor can do to raise substantial revenues on her own. So one of the other things that we're looking to Springfield for is to get something done on a real estate transfer tax that is fairer. Right now, we have a flat tax. Everybody pays the same amount regardless of the value of their home. We think that's regressive and unfair. And what we'd like to see is a progressive ramp that gives relief to homeowners at the lower end of the housing market value and make people upstream pay more of their fair share.
And do you need Springfield in order to make it progressive, or do you need Springfield for any change in the real estate transfer tax?
I believe we need them for any change.
Okay. Is there any other thing you're looking for out of Springfield? How about
Well, I mean-
how about them taking over the pensions?
Well, look, I think, as you know, the governor stood up a task force on pension consolidations for downstate related to police and fire. And so far, Chicago has not been part of that conversation. We think that the only fair thing to do and the only reasonable thing to do is to make Chicago part of that conversation as well, and then look at the larger structural issues that are driving our increasing pension debt and insolvency.
Okay.
And
when
that's
I- when I
obviously
watch
not
you-
going to be entirely done in a veto session, but we've got to start that conversation.
When I watched your speech last night, and you brought up the issue of hoping that Springfield will work with Chicago on these very specific things, my first thought was, does JB know she's going to bring this up in the speech today? Are they working on the same page?
I think we are. I mean, we've been very.
Did you tell him this was going to be part of your speech?
We've been very transparent and engaged with the governor and his team, the legislative leaders and their staff since April. So there's nothing that we said last night that we haven't said multiple times, both in terms of what we believe is the right approach, which is all in for the whole state. Also in terms of the numbers and the challenges that we face here in the city. I don't believe in surprises, and it wouldn't be any kind of a partnership if we weren't talking with them ahead of time.
Okay.
How would you keep the rest of the state from looking at an all-in approach as a Chicago bailout, which they're always inclined to do?
Because, as I said last night, this is an issue that's plaguing cities and towns all over the state. We've got 600 plus pension, police and fire pensions downstate that are on the cusp of insolvency because they don't have the revenues that they need to be able to keep those pensions going. They've done all the things that we have done historically: raised property taxes, sold assets, had their ratings reduced by rating agencies, and they're out of levers to pull, so they need help, just as we do. So this isn't a Chicago-specific thing. And the other thing I would say, obviously, is Chicago is 80% of the economy of the state. As Chicago goes, the state goes. We have to have a partnership. Our fates are intertwined. And now I know it's incumbent upon me to really make that case because of the historical cynicism that anything that benefits Chicago hurts the rest of the state, or vice versa. But I have had some very good feedback from legislators and also indirectly from mayors in other parts of the city, other parts of the state, that I think we're going to have a very robust chorus of people prevailing upon Springfield to help us fix this pension issue once and for all.
So where is most of the support that you're getting from other mayors when you talk about other cities and towns having the same problem. Where are you getting your most support?
Well, we are just starting the process of engagement with them. But, I mean, you look at the numbers, we know that Rockford has a problem, Peoria has a problem, and as I indicated, other really small municipalities downtown that maybe have one or two people in a pension fund that has to fund lots of different sources. So I think that there's an opportunity there. We're going to be working with the Illinois Municipal League to really reach out to mayors all across the state. So I think there's an opportunity there. And, you know, if last night is any indication, all of a lot of, I'll say, the state legislators who touch pieces of Chicago, everyone came up and said, I'm all in. How can I be helpful?
You outlined, though, a key challenge with the gambling bill, and it's going to be, and we had an editorial today about Arlington and the threat to shut down that track. I mean, what you're talking about here, these are major, heavy lifts. I mean, realistically, if a gambling bill gets fixed in the veto session, let alone ideas about bringing pension funds together, I mean, do we have to accept that higher property taxes are on the horizon here, maybe as a short-term solution, because some of these things could take years to figure out?
Well, they shouldn't take years to figure out. The pension question has been years in the making. There's been lots of efforts. Everybody from the Civic Federation and other groups like that have spelled out, I think, a number of potential remedies for addressing the pension issue. So this is not a new conversation. What I hope is new is a new enthusiasm to actually summon up the political will to get it done. On the casino issue, there's no reason why we shouldn't get this done. Now, we were raising the red flag before the legislation was signed off on that the tax structure wasn't going to work, that the casino couldn't get funded. We asked for and were lucky to get the feasibility study so they didn't have to just take our word that they'd have an independent source, and it came back precisely as we said. So this isn't about, I told you so, it's about let's roll up our sleeves and fix it, because a casino will benefit the entire state because of the potential revenue. $800 million is the upside that the independent feasibility study said could happen on an annual basis with the Chicago casino. $260 million bringing it back from Indiana. That's a win for the entire state, not just for Chicago.
Is that money for the city or just the revenue of the casino itself?
The revenue of the casino. Obviously, it'll be carved up in different ways.
Would you be comfortable having it in a downtown or touristy location if that tax structure is to your liking?
Look, I don't want to talk about location now, because then people run and say this one versus that one, and I don't want to fuel land speculation. If we get the tax structure right, which is the next big step, then we're obviously going to be interested in putting it in a location that will maximize revenues, but also not do harm to surrounding neighborhoods.
You talked about taxing services. Do you need Springfield to do that?
Yes.
And any specifics? You talked about legal services. What other?
Yeah, I mean, look, what I've talked about before is expanding the sales tax in effect to cover professional services. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that's going to happen is really dependent upon the appetite for that in Springfield.
Do you have a gist of the appetite for that in Springfield? Do you have an idea?
Not much. Meaning not much of an appetite at this point.
So are you going to be down there physically in Springfield yourself?
Oh,
on a
yes.
regular basis?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, I go back to my original question. I just have this feeling that if I were giving this speech last night, and this is very presumptuous of me, I would think if I'm going to call out Springfield specifically, that would be the governor, and say, hey, we need your help, and everyone knows what you're talking about. That I would, even though I might have had a good relationship for the last few months with that man, I would have said, I'm going to call him up and say, we're going to put this right to the speech. You didn't do that, is that?
No, that's not what I said.
No, you did do it?
I said exactly the opposite. I said
So you did?
I said that we have been talking with the governor and his team consistently, and I personally, as well as many members of my team, on a regular basis. I don't believe in surprises. And you can't build a partnership if you're not forthcoming and transparent.
And do you think Mark Brown, who, by the way, asked me to mention that he wishes he was here today, but he went on vacation today. Mark Brown makes a point in his column today that's going to be a particularly difficult challenge to get something out of Springfield and the pension help at a time when we're also trying to get a progressive income tax passed in November. That for a lot of downstaters, those two things won't work well together. Think that's an issue politically?
Look, we have to look at the entire ecosystem, what's happening.
Yeah.
If we don't get help from Springfield, we have limited options. And you know that one of those options is property taxes, a huge property tax, given the size of the deficit for next year. So we have to think about the timing of that, right? We go first, twice, this year, next year, before the voters go to the polls to approve the fair tax. So we have to take the long view of what that's going to mean. And I'm also mindful of the fact that in this state, the vast majority of high net worth earners live in the city of Chicago. We can't keep taxing the hell out of all of our people who make substantial incomes. That's not right, it's not fair, it's not going to work.
That, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask about that later. We have an op-ed in the paper today from he's the committeeman for Republic National Committee, GOP National Committee. He's the committeeman from Illinois, and Richard Porter. And his argument is that if you keep taxing the rest, they're just going to leave. Which, frankly, I'm never all that sympathetic to. But there is an argument that says at some point people will leave. As wonderful as our city is, and as much progress as we've seen with people coming back into the city, how far can you go with property taxes before you think people just cry uncle? And not just the middle class, but the wealthier people just
People are already crying
well,
uncle.
yeah, I know.
They already are.
How do we know because I think you are going to be raising property taxes, and if you do, how far can you go before you can't?
Look, what I don't know that there's been a definitive study that tells us what the precise tipping point will be, but people are already feeling it. First of all, we're still in a broken property tax assessment system. Let's keep in mind, right? We haven't gotten relief. The terrible system that Joe Barrios created, still the same system. Now, I'm not faulting Assessor Kagi, who I like a lot and I'm a big fan of and very supportive, but he still needs some additional tools to be able to fix that system. Chicago's not scheduled to be reassessed until 2021.
Yeah.
So raising property taxes in the context of that and the fact that we just came off of a historic property tax increase that ended in 2018, the one thing I hear about from people with clarity is they do not want their property taxes raised, and I hear them. We just had a huge reassessments that hit lots of parts of the city, particularly the north side. So resorting to that as the one and only lever, I think there would be a substantial backlash and people would be rightfully really angry. What I think is this, and why I place such emphasis on transparency and coming forward at the earliest possible stage to tell people the truth about what we're facing, be as transparent and as possible, putting together a budget forecast that actually people can understand and digest, is because if people don't feel like their government is legitimate, if they don't feel like we can be trusted, the mayor, the city council, then they are not going to support the things that are necessary, the hard choices that we have to make together. I know that to be true, which is why I'm placing such an emphasis on coming out, having a speech as early as we did, and really engaging people early, right? Budget hearings before, I don't know when they took place, but it was, pretty close in time, and I think having been at some of them, it was a little more kabuki theater than it was actually substantive. We put out a survey that we've engaged people on. What are we at right now with the survey?
5,000.
Oh, yeah, so we've been out with a survey for a week. We've already got 5,000 responses, and we're encouraging people in every way possible, because this is a problem that we all own and that we all have to work together to fix.
So what would be the hard choices? I mean, I was able to watch the speech as an ordinary citizen and not as a journalist because I'm semi-retired. what would be the hard choices that you think would have to be made if you don't get what you want from Springfield? I'm sure you'll get
Yeah.
something, but if you don't get all that you want, you're holding town hall meetings to really hear from Chicagoans about what they want.
Yes.
What would be some of those hard choices? That we
Well,
would have
I
to
mean,
make?
they're quite apparent, I think. Property tax increases, a very substantial one.
But you're
Cuts in-
saying, but you've already said you don't want to do that.
No, I'm
That's-
saying if we don't get help,
Okay.
then our options are limited. As a mayor, really, the only lever that I can pull that was gonna generate a substantial increases is property tax increases. And that is like the thing that I want to avoid, right? So if we're forced to go it alone, in essence, our choices are really limited. Property tax increases, cutbacks in services, potential layoffs, that's a nightmare scenario. And that's a scenario that I not only want to avoid, we can avoid it if we get partnership from Springfield.
Can you talk a little bit about, one of the hallmarks of the previous administration was that we were cleaning up scoop and toss. A lot of these municipal finance things that we've heard over the years were structurally wrong. The previous administration sort of touted its ability to clean all this up. Now we're seeing in your speech last night that there's additional things that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about that, or maybe somebody from your team can, in ways that the public can understand it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and then I'll pitch to Jenny and Susie. I mean, look, what was said was not necessarily what was done. So, $1 billion budget deficit doesn't sound like you've ended one-time fixes. Now, the truth of the matter is we're gonna have to engage in some one-time fixes, but we're gonna be really upfront and transparent about it and not pretend that we're doing something that we're not. But I'll pitch to Jenny to give more detail on that.
So one of the things that we've done in this budget, to the mayor's point about transparency, is to try to be more transparent about the number we're putting out there and taking out a lot of the, smoke and mirrors that occurred in previous budgets. One example of that would be settlements and judgments, where the amount that was budgeted last year was significantly lower than the actual amount that we ended up with. And as a result, is a key component of what the budget gap is now. And so we want to make sure that as we're releasing the number and what are the components of the budget gap, that we're telling taxpayers exactly what's happening, and then as we drive those solutions, that they're real solutions. By way of what our overall financial plan looks like and how is it that we're working towards structural balance in the long term, $800 million is clearly a very large gap, and I don't think anybody would expect that we would find $800 million of fully structural solutions in 1 year. But what's really important and important to the mayor is that we find a plan for a long-term balance. And, for example, with casinos, although a casino may not be built in the next year, it's a key component of that long-term structural balance. And so that's really the work that we're doing now, is building the plan for that. Where we end up for fiscal year 20 is too early to really talk specifics at this point. Yesterday was really the start of a conversation about what the budget gap number is, and the conversation that we're going to have with you, our advocates, our stakeholders, and most importantly, the citizens, about how we solve that and what proposal we release in October.
But I guess, is there an argument for, given all we heard about this previously, there's a line from the speech last night, eliminating $1.4 billion in short-term borrowing. Again, none of us on our side here are great financial minds. We went to journalism after all. But if we look at this, I mean, my understanding is there's sort of the strategy for short-term borrowing is it guards you sometimes against market shifts and sort of protects you. You said last night you're eliminating that $1.4 billion. Is there anything there that puts us at risk?
I think, no, let me be clear, I think you're conflating a couple different things. And again,
and that would not shock me.
Jenny's the expert, not me, but the $1.4 billion was a line of credit that we didn't need, yet we were paying fees and interest on that, even though we weren't drawing down and or using it. So eliminating that saved us $22 million, I think it was, because we had cash that we can cover what we need in the short term. So that's really what that was about.
And I want to add, to the mayor and Jenny's point, one of the things we changed this year with the forecasting is the methodology of how we're calculating the gap. So previously, they did not include pension costs or debt service, some of those long-term liabilities. We have added that to the gap. because that are costs that we are going to have to cover. So we started there, we did come out with a hopefully easier to read forecast. We have a 2-page summary for all of our residents so that, I know all of us read the forecast and probably the AFA previously, but we summarized it for residents so they can see exactly, how the gap was calculated, what goes into it, all the costs that go into the budget, all the expenses and the revenues, so that people can really digest and understand where we're starting from as we go through this budget process.
And I have to add, as Susie was talking, I thought of a caution that I got from somebody who was involved in the finance of the previous administration around settlements and judgments, like, don't put that into the budget. Once you put that in, you're gonna have to own that and people are gonna hold you accountable. Yeah, actually, that's the point. The point is to be honest, to put the expenses on the table, hold ourselves accountable and let the public see what's going on. Not hiding it or grossly underestimating what the actual expense is gonna be and then act shocked when, for example, I think the amount budgeted in settlements for last year was about $60 million.
Yes.
And what we did just in the police department alone was $113 million.
But isn't that kind of unpredictable? It's not something the city can know what's going to happen. The courts decide it. One big settlement could drive that. Is it really fair to say that that was smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying smoke and mirrors. I'm saying
You did
put
say
it on the
smoke- you said
table.
smoke and mirrors.
Put it, not specific to that, but put it on the table, be honest about it, and actually do some reserving and some forecasting for what it is, and not just act like it's this tiny fraction of the reality. If you look at, for example, on settlements, what's been budgeted over the last, say, 5 years, and what actually happened, they grossly underestimated every single year. And it's not because they were bad at math, it's because they didn't want that to be seen. So we are saying, good, bad, or indifferent, we're gonna endeavor to put the number out there, but also, not just in being transparent, we're gonna work to drive that number down, because we have to. We can't afford to continue in perpetuity to have settlements and judgments, whether it's the police department or in the aggregate, to exceed the numbers that they are exceeding. It's unsustainable. A big reason why I push to hire a chief risk officer, and Tamika Puckett's here with us from Atlanta, is because we didn't have any kind of robust enterprise risk system, and we're hemorrhaging money. We have to stop that. But a big part of putting the pressure on us to do it is being transparent about what that looks like.
So you're saying politically, the previous administration didn't want people to focus on the amount of how much the city was spending on these settlements, right? Police,
Correct.
right? Was it also a consideration that defense attorneys who are bringing these civil suits, also, you don't want them to see how much money's been budgeted, so they won't think there's a big pool of money they can keep fighting for?
Possibly. But I think,
I would think that's a real important motivation.
however, if you're not, I'll use the word honest in the way that you budget, then you're not going to be honest in the way that you hold people accountable, or you may not even hold people accountable. And then the risk keeps going and going and going, and nobody stops and says, hey, why is this happening? Is it a training issue? Is it a supervision issue? What's going on that we have in Chicago? And I could go on and on all day, and I won't. I'll just finish this point. We are such an outlier across the country in the amount of lawsuits that get filed every single year against our police department. And it's not just opportunistic plaintiffs' lawyers. We have a system that is fundamentally broken because we've never asked the question. And the fact that we have these settlements and judgments related to the police department that exist outside of the police department and there's zero accountability, that's a problem. And we are going to solve that and fix that. There has to be accountability for the way in which we spend taxpayers' dollars. And it's not just the police department, it's overall. We have asked our departments, tell us what you believe are your core functions. And then outside of that, you got to justify to us why we're spending all this additional money. That is a reasonable thing to do when we're facing a fiscal crisis. And before we go to the taxpayers and say, give us all the change in your pocket and your bank account, we owe that to them to take a look at ourselves and what we're doing in city government and how we're using their money.
Are there any big projects that you anticipated you'd be doing in their first 4 years that given the surprising gap that is much larger than you expected, that you now think you might have to table? Specifically, for instance, it will cost a lot of money to build that new police and fire training facility. Is that something maybe you say to yourself, okay, we're gonna have to put that off a little longer while we figure out these financial problems?
Well, that precise project we can't put off because we have an obligation to substantially step up our training under the consent decree. So we have to get that right. And I think there's a lot of things that we're gonna have to structurally change in the way that project is currently conceived, but I don't think we can do that. I mean, I'd love to have an actual capital budget and plan for the city so that we're not kind of lurching year to year, project to project, that we can actually consistently think about what the infrastructure needs are. That's gonna be a little more challenging in this environment. But there's nothing else that I'm thinking that we are gonna have to either forego entirely or completely rethink it at this juncture. But, and I'll let you fill in the blank, we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
You mentioned canceling contracts from vendors who didn't deliver what they promised, and that speaks to an efficiency question or whatever. How much would you say can we save through these efficiency? Is it substantial? Is there that much inefficiency, or is it not? And
I'll say yes, I think there's a lot that we can. Will it solve the entirety of our budget problem? No.
Obviously not.
But I think there's a lot more. I mean, I'll start and I'll let these guys jump in. Workers' comp, $100 million a year. We had 600 claims that are open for a decade. We spent almost $270 million on those open claims that were unresolved and people weren't back to work. Do we think we can save some money there? I think so. We've got, you talked about contracts. I'll give you one example that just like lit my wick when I found out about it. We had somebody who was handling a lawsuit for us that had been dismissed. But for 14 more months, that law firm continued to bill us as if there was an active lawsuit going on. Now, they were either incompetent or they were committing fraud. Either way, we paid them for something that we didn't get the benefit of our bargain. There are other examples like that. So I think that by putting in a robust enterprise risk management system, really demanding accountability to manage these contracts. We have our water department. The vast majority of the work that the water department does is by third-party vendors or digging up our streets and putting in new water mains. Are we getting the benefit of our bargain there? Well, we're sure taking a hard look to make sure that we are. And contract after contract. And I know this from my private practice work. I'm a little bit of a procurement geek. You can negotiate the best deal, 10 cents for a pen, but what do you actually get when the invoices come in? And if you don't pay attention to that, you're gonna get cheated. Unfortunately, that is the practical reality. And with all the hundreds of millions of dollars, and really billions of dollars that the city does every year in procurement, I think it's about $3 billion every year. We have got to do a better job of managing those contracts to make sure that we get the benefit of our bargain.
Yeah, you mentioned workers' comp, and you mentioned this yesterday, Ed Burke, and looking at that. And you talk about, efficiencies, not the best. What I'm looking for, and I wonder if you've seen any evidence of this so far, is simply, now that you can see what's going on in the workers' comp program like nobody has really seen before, in the short time you've been able to do that, have you seen any outright fraud? Are there going to be people who are now getting workers' comp, maybe going back decades, who simply are not needing workers' comp? It's just political payoffs and that sort of thing.
Well, I don't think we know enough yet. We were just started the process of peeling back the onion. We hired a third-party vendor. They're in the process of kind of getting all the data actually digitized because a lot of it wasn't in systems that were easy to track. I suspect we're probably going to see that. I mean, you all and other media outlets over the years have done exposés on people who say, oh, I can't lift my arm to shoot. In fact, they're like, a big game hunter. I think that was one of your stories. And also what I'm going to press our people to look at is not just the workers. I want to look at the lawyers and the doctors and the other people. I want to do that candidly before the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI does. But if we see something, I'm not going to hesitate to make the appropriate referral.
That's right, it's a whole system, isn't it? Not just the recipients.
That's right.
Yeah. Questions?
Can I have two?
Yes.
One, Alderman Hopkins yesterday seemed to believe that the $838 million number that you said yesterday doesn't include revenue projections and things of that sort. It doesn't include how well the city's been doing at bringing in revenue. And he said that's possibly because you want to present this big number, and then later on in October, before your budget address, you want the deficit to be a little smaller by including those revenue things. And maybe that's why we're seeing that number, that you want to have a victory. Is that, what's your response to that?
With due respect to the alderman, for me to come out and put out a number like that as a political ploy, first of all, he clearly doesn't know me well enough, because that's not how I roll. It's a big number, and it's a real number, and we can back it up. We can give the documentation. And Alderman Hopkins said in a briefing 2 days ago where we laid it out precisely for him. So I'm not sure why he would say that. It is bad. It's not a facade. It is a tough, terrible thing that kept me up at night when I understood the magnitude of the problem. It's real.
Second question, Michael Bauer died yesterday.
Yeah.
What's your response to that? Can you talk about, I guess, your connection to him? I believe you also worked on the campaign. Can you talk about
He was my campaign chairman.
what do you think?
You know, it's really hard. My wife shared the news with me after the speech last night because she didn't want me to know ahead of time. I feel fortunate that I went and sat with Michael 2 weeks ago. We didn't say it, but I think both knew that it was to say goodbye. At that time, he was still very alert, but it was clear that his body was failing him. You know, I mean, he was an incredibly vibrant guy, and very opinionated. Was one of the first people I talked to when I thought about running for mayor, and he was by my side every step of the way. Very encouraging, introducing me to people, and really sharing the benefit of his incredible political knowledge. I'm still taking in the fact that he's passed on. It's been really hard for me to think about him suffering. And I worry about Roger.
Do you have any, I guess, favorite stories or favorite memories?
I mean, the thing that I've been comforting myself with over these last few weeks when I knew that the end was near is his incredible laughter. I mean, he had a big, huge barrel laugh. And that he really loved life. He really did. And it was a really hard moment to be with him, for him to say out loud that he knew his time was short. So as always happens when I lose someone who's close to me, I think about the essence of them and what really made them unique and special.
When you have situations like personal things like this, is the job what you expected it to be? Is it in your just daily workflow, life, family, life, death, pursuit of happiness? How is it going for you personally?
I'm enjoying it enormously. I will say that I'm actually having a lot of fun, and I get to work with people like this every day, which there's nothing better than working with incredibly smart, hardworking folks, as they are, and a huge team that's not here. But it's a hard job. There's no question about it. And the hardest thing isn't trying to fix problems. The hardest thing is realizing that I have an obligation to people who maybe haven't ever seen a mayor before. I keep going into neighborhoods where I hear from people all the time. They've never met a mayor, ever. And it's not little kids or teenagers or 20-somethings. These are, elders who are 60, 70 years old and have never had the opportunity to have a mayor come on their block, be in their neighborhood, ask them their opinion or question about things.
Is that a knock on your predecessors?
It's
or
not,
is that-
it's not a knock on them, and it's not intended to be a knock on them. It's just, I have a very different, I think, sense of the importance of being out and being present in neighborhoods. I learn a lot from those experiences. I learn a lot from what I see intellectually, but I also learn a lot about in my own heart and my own and my own sense of right and wrong. I mean, the toughest thing that I've encountered in these last couple months is going into neighborhoods and seeing kids in desperate circumstances. And then getting in my nice SUV and leaving. I can't talk about it without being emotional because I feel emotional about it. We have to do better for our kids in the city.
That's an experience I think a lot of reporters have.
I'm sorry?
That's an experience a lot of reporters have. My whole career here, you drop into a community, you see all these things, you try to write about it, but then you go home. And your life is not that experience. It's strange. You know?
So, Mayor, there was a moment, and I don't want to misquote you, but there was a moment in your speech where you basically said, or essentially said, that you were willing to risk your political career to get it right. So what decisions do you think that you would have to make that would put your political career at risk in this situation?
Well, there could be a range, right? And I will add, there were a lot of folks on my team that said, please don't say that. But I felt it was really important. I didn't come into this job thinking I'm going to be the mayor for life. I actually believe in term limits. But I also feel like I took this risk and made this decision so I could really make a difference and have impact. And I don't know what the future holds. I'm not looking at empire building, so I want to have maximum impact now in this term as quickly as I can. And I made the statement in the context of thinking about pensions because I truly believe the only thing that's holding us back is political will. I really believe that. And so I'm willing to take the political risk to not play it safe, to get something done. And then beyond that, you know, I hear every day, well, that's not how we do it. That's not how we've ever done it. And I say, okay, but this is how we're doing it now. And so in big things and small things, we are pushing against the status quo. I think that's what people hired me to do, to not just accept the current construct for anything, but to be honest and be tough and fair and try to engage people as much as I can. I mean, I'm going to step into a little bit of hot water here, but I'm going to do it anyway. You know, we've been having this ongoing tussle in the media with the Cook County Board President about bail reform. The issue for me isn't about bail reform. Of course we should have bail reform. I think we should end cash bail. I don't think we should be creating a debtor's prison. I think the two questions a judge should have when they're thinking about pretrial detention is flight risk, danger to the community. It should come down to that simple calculus. But I also think we cannot keep returning people to the streets who are wreaking havoc in neighborhoods. I can't in good conscience say to people, please cooperate with the police so we can improve our homicide clearance rate when people are cycling through the system literally in 24 and 48 and 72 hours who are possessing weapons of war. I mean, we've seen circumstances over this summer, and I held up a picture at one of our news conferences of a automatic firearm that was customized because of these nice little polished wood grips. At the same time, those same people had armor-piercing bullets, which are intended for one thing and one thing only. I just cannot believe in good conscience that we think that it is a good idea for people who possess weapons like that. Yeah, we didn't catch them in the act of shooting, thank God, But that doesn't mean they're not a danger to the community. The most common charge that the state's attorney makes when they see somebody possessing is a UUW, unlawful use of a weapon. That's not considered a crime of violence in Cook County, given what we've been facing, really? So, yeah, I'm going to take that fight every day, because that is about keeping our community safe. It's about me being a voice for victims in neighborhoods on the west side, on the south side, in Roseland, in South Shore, in Inglewood, where people are lit up every single day, literally, and are afraid to come out of their houses.
Do you hear that from people?
Absolutely.
You know, what you just said about he just had a gun, he went to jail, he came right back out.
I sure do. I hear it from ordinary citizens, and I hear it from police. Every single time I'm out in the community, it comes up.
What, after President Preckwinkle's letter to you, what have your conversations?
Which, by the way, I got after she talked to one of your reporters.
Yeah. What have those conversations been like? Have you sat down
With
her?
President Preckwinkle?
Yes.
Zero.
Zero. You haven't, no conversations?
Nope.
Have you reached out to her?
Nope,
Has she reached out to you?
not that I recall. I think there've been some, I hesitate to call them communications, but there've been some conversation at the staff level. But I have had conversations with the chief judge, the presiding judge, Sheriff Dart. I want to get something done.
Can you speak to the chief judge's statistics that he says show that that is not happening and that people are not committing crimes, violent crimes with guns while out on bond?
I see a different set of data that tells a different story. And what I know,
What's wrong with this data?
I don't know. We have to analyze it, and we will do that. He showed me, we just had a conversation the other day, and he presented some statistics to me that show that the people who are reoffending are at a very, very small percentage. But I don't know that that tells a whole story, in part because, unfortunately, we know that people aren't getting caught. So to base your statistics on arrest alone, when arrests we know are a very imperfect barometer of what's actually happening, because the clearance rate, meaning the arrest rate, is low relative to what's actually happening, I don't think that that tells the whole story. And it also, again, doesn't address the issue, that the point that I was making earlier, which is, if I know that Susie's a shooter and she gets arrested for possessing a gun, maybe not even shooting, but just possessing a gun, and I breathe this sigh of relief that, thank God, Susie's not my neighbor anymore. And then I go to bed one night and wake up the next day and I see Susie walking brazenly down the street again a few days later. That doesn't give me any comfort that the criminal justice system sees or hears me as somebody who is a victim.
And Tim Evans would say that the statistics show that judges are giving far more no bonds to people on gun charges than ever before.
Well, what I also know is that if you look at the number of people that are out on electronic monitoring, one, there are people who are charged with murder, aggravated battery with a firearm, that are out on EM, electronic monitoring, which I don't understand why that's a thing. And what I also know, first of all, there's two systems of EM, which make no sense to me. But what I also know is that the resources to actually watch the people on electronic monitoring are really limited. And he would be the first to acknowledge that.
Back to the Preckwinkle thing, you guys haven't spoken. Obviously, she started this whole problem by breaking it into the media first before speaking with you. But I guess why not reach out to her, since you have one data set, she seems to have another,
Well,
and there's discrepancy?
let me be clear. I have said, Madam President, Chief Judge, Sheriff, State's Attorney, let's get together, let's put our data out for the public to be able to see it, and let's work together towards solutions. And what I got back was not a, yeah, that's a great idea. I got back another nastygram from her. So other people that are part of this ecosystem have reached out and said, let's have a conversation, And I commend the chief judge and the presiding judge and Sheriff Dart and State's Attorney Kim Fox, because I think all of us can actually, and also Clerk Brown, all of us, I think, can make some progress, and we will make progress.
So I guess the larger concern I would have is that, is this relationship between you and Tony Preckwinkle going to make it detract from your abilities to work together on other issues? I mean, we're talking about a woman who's a very important person in the Democratic political party here, and you need you need everybody you've got on your team down in Springfield. Is there an issue here that we should be concerned that you and Tony Preckwinkle are estranged politically?
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to impede the city's ability to get done what we need to get done, wherever that is.
You don't think it would help to have the Cook County Board President?
Well, that's not the question you ask.
Well, I'm asking that now. Would it help to have the Cook County Board
course.
President sitting in your office, working with you to get something done in Springfield?
Or me sitting in her office, of course. We have overlapping jurisdictions. We have multiple things that are of concern to residents in this county. Of course, having a good, strong, productive relationship would absolutely inure to the benefit of people
Can you get there?
in this city, in this county. I'm sorry?
Can you get there?
A lot of that is up to her. I sat down with her during the transition, before the inauguration, as an effort of good faith to try to start to build that relationship. Actually, a week before, she sat down and provided a letter to the public before she talked to me. We actually had a meeting in my conference room where her and her chief of staff and her team came. We outlined a number of ways in which I thought we could work together productively on things that are important to both the city and the county. But some things are clearly more important to her than others.
Oh, you guys won't be
Well,
throwing
let's-
frisbee around. No birthday
Hacky
parties.
sack,
Yeah.
no.
You might have wished we'd done this 5 minutes earlier, but what I'm thinking now is we should probably end our live stream of this meeting. So we'd like to say thanks to all the folks who might be watching and listening, and thank you for doing that with us. So.
Sure, my pleasure.
We'll give you a public service announcement. Where can people go to sign up to attend these town halls and do all those things?
So we do have a website, it's chicago.gov/2020 budget. So we've consolidated everything into that website so that you can take a survey, the budget forecast is there, and I will make sure that everything is up there, and then all the town hall information as well.
Are we off the live stream now?